May 13th, 1940, 7 in the morning, the Meuse River at Sedan, France. Corporal Henri Vernier of the 55th Infantry Division stands in a shallow trench on the western bank and watches the morning mist burn off the water. His unit has held this position for 3 days. German infantry has probed their lines twice. Both times the French held. Both times the Germans retreated. Vernier is not afraid. He has been trained. He has a rifle, a helmet, and orders. His lieutenant has told him that the Maginot Line holds to the south, that the British are to the north, and that no German army has broken through a prepared French defensive position in this war. The math is simple. The math is comforting. Somewhere to the east, he hears a sound he doesn't recognize. Low at first, like wind through telegraph wires. Then, higher. Then a frequency that seems to bypass his ears entirely and reach something deeper. Some ancient, mammalian register that predates language and training, and orders. The sound builds into a wail, an industrial shriek falling from the sky. And in the 7 seconds before the first bomb hits, Corporal Vernier's 3 days of successful soldiering dissolve completely. He runs. He doesn't decide to run. He runs. He is not alone. Within 90 seconds, an entire battalion of trained French infantry has left their positions along a kilometre of prepared riverbank, not because of casualties, not because of German infantry, not because of any conventional military pressure. They have been driven from the field by a sound. What Corporal Vernier heard was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber beginning its attack run. What he actually felt, what broke him and 3,000 men beside him, was a wind-driven siren bolted beneath its fixed undercarriage, spinning up to full pitch as the aircraft dived. The Germans called it the Jericho Trumpet, the Trumpet of Jericho. The engineers who designed it had read their Bible. The walls did come down, but this is not the story of the aircraft. This is not the story of the pilot in the cockpit, watching his targets scatter like frightened birds. This is the story of what it felt like to be standing on the ground when the scream arrived, and it is the story of how ordinary soldiers, French conscripts on the Meuse, British Tommies on the beaches of Dunkirk, and finally, American farm boys from Ohio and Georgia who had never heard a bomb fall in their lives, learned to stand still, look up, and take the Stuka's most powerful weapon away from it, forever. This is the story of the Trumpet of Jericho, and how the walls learned to stop falling. If you appreciate war stories told with accuracy, respect, and without sensationalism, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Many of the men who endured these moments are no longer here to tell their stories. Keeping their experiences remembered matters. If you're watching on your television, simply press the up button on your remote and select subscribe now. May 13th, 1940. The French army of May 1940 is not what history has made it. That matters, and it matters here. The men of the 55th Infantry Division are not cowards. They are not poorly trained, not badly equipped, not defeatist. The 55th is a Series B Reserve Division. Older men, fathers of families, veterans of the 194-18 war, who know what German artillery sounds like, and have not run from it. Their commanders have defensive doctrine, field manuals, prepared positions. They have 40mm anti-tank guns. They have the Meuse River in front of them, a natural barrier 15 meters wide, with bridges that can be blown on command. What they do not have is any frame of reference for what is about to happen to them. In the Western armies of 1940, the doctrine for defending against air attack is straightforward. Take cover, return fire with anti-aircraft weapons if available, and hold position. The assumption embedded in every training manual is that aircraft attack fast, depart fast, and that their actual bomb loads, however terrifying in the moment, are limited. A platoon that holds its nerve will survive an air attack with acceptable casualties. The math, again, appears to be on their side, but the men who built the Stuka were not doing math the way the French were. And the man who would deploy it at Sedan, General der Flieger Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding 8th Fliegerkorps, was not thinking about bombs at all. Von Richthofen was the nephew of the Red Baron, He had watched air power develop across 2 decades and had arrived at a conclusion that most conventional military thinkers had not yet reached, that an aircraft's psychological effect on ground troops was often measurably larger than its physical effect. A soldier who runs from a bomb that misses him by 30 meters is a soldier removed from the battle just as surely as if he'd been hit. He cannot fire his weapon while running. He cannot hold his position. He cannot communicate. He is, for military purposes, a casualty, and the bomb that drove him away costs the Luftwaffe nothing extra. Von Richthofen had seen this principle confirmed in Spain during the Civil War, where German Condor Legion Stukas had produced tactical collapses in Republican units that seemed wildly disproportionate to the actual damage inflicted. He had noted it carefully, he had written it down, and now, in May 1940, with the breakthrough at Sedan representing the hinge of the entire Manstein Plan, the pivot on which the whole war in the West would turn, von Richthofen prepared to test his theory at maximum scale. His operational diary entry for May 12, 1940, is remarkably direct. The translation from the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv reads, "Concentrated Stuka employment planned for the Sedan sector, morning of the 13th. Object is not solely destruction of defensive works, but total dissolution of the enemy's will to resist. Effect must be overwhelming and continuous. No intervals that permit recovery. No intervals that permit recovery. That is the key sentence. That is what made the attack at Sedan different from every previous use of air power in the war. He was going to make the trumpets of Jericho play without stopping." On the morning of May 13th, von Richthofen concentrated 2 full Stuka Grappen, nearly 200 dive bombers, over the Sedan bridgehead in rotating waves. Not one raid, not 2 raids, an unceasing carousel of aircraft orbiting at altitude, peeling off in attack runs every few minutes, while the ones already committed pulled out of their dives, climbed, and rejoined the formation. The sirens rose and fell and rose again. For hours, the French defenders of the 55th Division were subjected to something closer to sonic torture than air bombardment. Sergeant Marcel Roquefort, whose account appears in Karl-Heinz Friese's landmark work on the Blitzkrieg, described waiting for the next attack, while the previous one still had his hands shaking. You would barely get yourself back in the trench before the next one was coming. The sound would start again, that screaming, and something in you that you thought was solid, it went away. I saw men weeping, not from wounds, just weeping. The actual casualty figures at Sedan, on May 13th, are instructive in a way that still disturbs military historians. Post-war analysis of French medical records and unit strength returns suggests that the Stuka attacks on the 55th Division's positions caused relatively few direct casualties from bombs. The positions were constructed correctly. The cover was adequate. Precision dive bombing, even by trained Stuka crews, was not so accurate that it systematically destroyed individual rifle pits and machine gun nests. What it destroyed was the men inside them. The after-action reports, when French officers finally wrote them, weeks later, by which time France had already fallen, are full of a particular phrase that recurs almost verbatim across multiple units. Les hommes ne pouvaient plus supporter. The men could no longer endure. Not the men were killed. Not the men were overrun. The men could no longer endure. This is what von Richthofen had designed. This is what the Jericho Trumpet was built for. And to understand why it worked so devastatingly, you have to understand what it was, mechanically, physiologically, and psychologically. The device itself is almost insultingly simple. It is a 6-bladed impeller, roughly the size of a dinner plate, mounted on the fixed undercarriage strut of the Ju-87. As the aircraft dives and airspeed increases, the impeller spins, forcing air through a resonating chamber. The resulting sound rises in pitch and volume with the aircraft's speed, reaching approximately 90 decibels at the dive entry point and continuing to build as the Stuka accelerates toward its release altitude. The Junkers engineering records show that the device was developed and patented in 1937. A Luftwaffe procurement directive from that year cited in Manfred Greel's definitive technical study of the Stuka, formally designates the SIREN as a Kampfmittel zur Feindemoralisierung, a combat means for enemy demoralization. Not an auxiliary warning device, not a signaling instrument, a demoralization weapon. The Germans understood exactly what they had built. The reason it works on human beings goes deeper than simple loudness. Sound researchers studying the Jericho Trumpet's frequency profile after the war noted that the siren's rising pitch during a dive falls within the same acoustic range as the alarm calls of predatory birds, a frequency range that appears to trigger autonomic stress responses in mammals, regardless of prior experience or conditioning. In other words, some part of the brain that predates human consciousness responds to that rising wail as a threat signal before the conscious mind can process and override it. The effect is not rational. It cannot be argued away. It has to be trained away. And in 1940, nobody knew that yet. The German Stuka crews knew something was working. They didn't need to know why. What they saw, pulling out of their dives over the Meuse on the morning of May 13th, was an entire defensive line beginning to empty. Men visible in the open, running west. Machine gun positions going quiet, not because they'd been bombed, but because their crews had abandoned them. A river crossing that German engineers had been expected to fight for all day being contested. By afternoon, only sporadically, because the soldiers assigned to contest it had been screened off the field. By evening, German infantry engineers had pontoon bridges across the Meuse. The hinge of the Manstein plan had pivoted exactly as designed. The campaign in the West was, in a very real sense, decided that morning, not by panzers, not by German infantry courage, not by any failure of French equipment or numbers. It was decided by 200 aircraft with wind-driven tin whistles bolted to their wheels, and the French 55th Division's survivors, streaming westward through the afternoon and into the night, carried something with them more dangerous than any wound. They carried the sound, and wherever they went, they told people what was coming. Panic, military historians have long understood, is contagious in a way that courage is not. Courage requires individual decision. It requires a man to override his fear with his reason, his training, his pride, his loyalty to the men beside him, all of which take time and cognitive effort under stress. Panic requires none of this. Panic is a virus that jumps from man to man at the speed of a running figure on a road, at the speed of a rumor, at the speed of a sound rising from the eastern horizon. In the days that followed the Sedan crossing, the panic that had originated at the 55th Division's positions spread westward through the French army like a wave. Units that had not yet been bombed began abandoning positions when they heard that the Stukas were coming. The word itself, Stuka, acquired a power that the aircraft's actual capabilities did not fully justify. German records from May 1940 are full of ground commanders reporting French positions mysteriously empty when their infantry arrived, abandoned not under fire, but in anticipation of fire that in some cases never came. The operational mechanics of this were not accidental. Von Richthofen's staff had studied their own results from the previous campaigns and understood that the Stuka's psychological radius extended well beyond its physical one. An attack on one unit sent ripples of collapse through adjacent units that had never been touched. The Wehrmacht's advance in France moved faster than its supply lines could support, partly because the Stukas were clearing road after road and position after position of defenders who fled not from the actual aircraft, but from the idea of it. Meanwhile, on the roads north and west, another category of victim encountered the Stuka for the first time. Civilians. The refugee columns choking the roads of Belgium and northern France in May 1940 were themselves weaponized against the Allied armies. German tactical doctrine, documented in Luftwaffe operational orders from this period, specifically authorized Stuka attacks on refugee columns to create maximum road congestion. The screaming dives that scattered civilians across ditches and fields also blocked the roads that Allied commanders needed to move reserves and ammunition. The physical damage to the refugees was often slight. The road blockage lasted for hours, The Allied command structure, already under severe strain, began to choke on its own inability to move. The British Expeditionary Force, retreating northward toward the Channel coast, encountered the Stukas under conditions even more psychologically intense than the French had faced. On the roads and beaches around Dunkirk, particularly at La Panne and Malo-les-Bains, where units of the 3rd Infantry Division waited for evacuation in late May 1940, the combination of helplessness, exhaustion, and Stuka attack produced some of the most vivid accounts of combat terror preserved in the English language. Sergeant Norman Smith, a career soldier of the BEF, who had served with the 3rd Division through the campaign and reached the Dunkirk perimeter, wrote a letter home in June 1940 that was preserved and later quoted in Norman Gelb's account of the evacuation. Smith was not a man given to emotional language. His letter is written in the flat, understated style of the English working-class soldier, which makes what he describes all the more striking. "You'd hear it before you saw anything," Smith wrote. "That whine. And the thing is, once you heard it, it was too late to do anything sensible. Men just went into the sea, some of them. I saw a sergeant who'd been in the last war, a man I respected, go face down in the sand and stay there for a quarter hour after the planes had gone. He wasn't wounded. He couldn't get up. I didn't blame him. I understood it. There is something in that sound that gets past everything you know about yourself. The beach at Dunkirk was the worst possible psychological environment for men facing dive bombers. There was nowhere to go, no defensive position to retreat to, no tree line to shelter in, no ground to burrow into that offered real protection. The men on those beaches were simply exposed to the sun, to the Channel wind, to the German aircraft overhead. The Stuka's design had always assumed that its victims could run. On those beaches, running accomplished nothing. It only burned energy that men were going to need to stay alive. And yet, they ran anyway, or pressed themselves into sand that couldn't protect them, because the siren demanded it. The autonomic nervous system doesn't perform cost-benefit analysis. It hears the predator call, and it acts. The medical officers attached to the BEF units at Dunkirk began documenting what they were seeing in clinical terms. Their reports, filed with the War Office in the months after the evacuation, represent some of the earliest formal military psychiatric literature on what would come to be called Stuka panic, a specific stress reaction distinct from ordinary combat fear. Characterized by onset triggered by acoustic stimulus before the actual attack, and persisting well after the immediate danger had passed. Soldiers who had been dive-bombed showed elevated startle responses to any high-pitched sound for weeks afterward. Some could not sleep if there was wind, because wind through structures could, in certain frequencies, approximate the Jericho Trumpet. These were not weak men. They were trained soldiers who had encountered a weapon for which their training had not prepared them. The British Army's War Office took careful note. The question, how do you train men not to break when the siren screams, would occupy a small but intensely focused group of military psychologists for the next 2 years. That question didn't have an answer in 1940. In 1940, the Stuka was still unbeatable in the only arena that mattered, the arena of the human mind. It followed the retreating armies into the desert. Corporal R.L. Crimp reached North Africa with the British 8th Army in 1941 and kept a diary that he eventually published under the title Diary of a Desert Rat. His account of Stuka attacks in the Western Desert is remarkable for the way it charts the evolution of his own psychological response, not over the course of the war, but within a single attack. The first time Stukas hit his unit in the desert, Crimp writes, he simply ran. No thought, no decision, pure flight response. I was 20 yards from the slit trench before I knew I'd moved. How I'd got there, I genuinely couldn't tell you. I just was running. The second attack, a week later, he managed to make it to cover before the bombs fell, but spent the duration face down with his hands over his head. The third attack, he found he could stay in position, though his hands shook, and he couldn't have fired his weapon accurately. What Crimp describes is, in essence, spontaneous desensitization, the nervous system slowly building tolerance through repeated exposure. He was learning to function under the siren's influence, not because anyone had taught him to, but because experience had gradually mapped the sound against survivable outcomes. He was still afraid. He was simply less incapacitated than before. What military commanders began to understand, studying cases like Crimp's alongside the War Office psychiatric reports, was that the Stuka's power was not indestructible. It was not some fundamental property of the aircraft that could never be countered. It was a specific learned response, which meant it could be unlearned, or better, preemptively taught away. The British War Office Training Memorandum No. 46, issued in 1941, and titled simply Anti-Dive Bomber Drills for Infantry, represents the first formal attempt to build this inoculation into training doctrine. The document's language is remarkable for its explicit acknowledgement of what the problem actually is. Not the bombs, but the sound. Experience has shown, the memorandum reads, that casualties from dive bombing are frequently lighter than the degree of disorder in affected units would suggest. The primary effect of dive bombing on unsupported infantry is psychological. Training must specifically address this effect. The prescribed drill is almost confrontational in its simplicity. Soldiers in the open are to stand fast when aircraft are observed commencing a dive attack. They are to take cover at the last possible moment, when the aircraft is within identifiable bombing range, but they are not to run, and they are not to abandon their weapons or positions. Designated anti-aircraft observers are to call out the aircraft's position continuously, giving men something to focus on other than their own fear. It is easy, 70 years later, to read that drill and think it sounds reasonable. It is much harder to appreciate what it was asking of men who had experienced the Stuka. It was asking them to stand in an open field and listen to the siren rise to full pitch while making conscious decisions about when to take cover. It was asking the rational mind to override an autonomic response that arrived milliseconds faster. The British began training it. It was hard. Some men couldn't do it at first. The drill had to be conducted with actual aircraft, simulated attacks by friendly dive bombers, because no amount of classroom instruction produced the required response. You had to hear the real sound, feel the real physiological reaction, and practice overriding it until the override became fast enough to be useful. This was the state of Allied understanding when, in the autumn of 1942, the first American soldiers arrived in North Africa and encountered the Stuka for the very first time. They were not ready. February 14th, 1943, the Allied lines at Faid Pass, Tunisia. The men of Combat Command A, 1st Armored Division, United States Army, are the best equipped soldiers the Western Hemisphere has ever put in the field. They have Sherman tanks, M7 self-propelled artillery, half-tracks, jeeps, a logistics train that would have seemed fantastical to any army in the previous century. They are fit, young, average age 22, and have been in North Africa for 3 months. They have fired their weapons in training for thousands of hours. They have never been dive-bombed. Private Albert Turner, of the 1st Armored, whose post-war oral history is preserved in the archives at Fort Knox, described the morning of February 14th with a specificity that comes from the way terrible experiences burn themselves permanently into memory. "We heard them about 5 minutes before they showed up," Turner recalled. "I didn't know what the sound was. My sergeant said, 'Stukas,' just like that. One word, like that, explained everything. And I could tell from his face it did explain everything, but nobody told me what that meant. Then they came over the ridge and went into their dives, and I swear to God the sound they made coming down was like nothing I'd ever heard. Like a building falling on you. Like the air itself was screaming." Turner ran. He is not ashamed of it in his account, and there is no reason he should be. Every man around him ran. The men in the tanks, the men with 6 inches of steel around them, threw open their hatches and ran. A company of artillery pieces, positioned and registered on known German locations, was abandoned in the first 60 seconds of the attack. The guns were still loaded, still perfectly aimed. They simply had no crews. The U.S. Army after-action reports from the KASSERINE Pass battle preserved in the National Archives Record Group. 407. The 1st Armored Division operational files contain language that is unusual in official military documents, precisely because it is honest about what happened. Combat Command A's report for February 14th-19th states, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone trying to describe something they still don't fully understand, air attack was in many cases more effective in producing unit dissolution than German armor or artillery. Personnel recovered from air attack positions reported the psychological effect of dive bombing to be the most significant single factor in their combat experience to date. Most significant single factor in their combat experience. These were men who had also been shelled, machine-gunned, and in some cases run over by panzer formations. And the thing they found hardest to bear was the SIREN. The subsequent German ground assault exploited these gaps with brutal efficiency. Where American infantry should have been defending, along the passes, behind the ridgelines, on the road to KASSERINE, they were not. They had been bombed out of position, in many cases with minimal actual casualties, and had not yet found their way back when the panzers arrived. The result was a rout that still stands as one of the most embarrassing episodes in American military history. Nearly 1,000 men killed or wounded, 4,206 taken prisoner, and equipment losses that included 183 tanks and hundreds of artillery pieces, many abandoned intact. Rommel, reading the American after-action reports that German intelligence managed to obtain, noted with clinical satisfaction that the Americans were responding to Stuka attack in exactly the pattern that the Wehrmacht's experience in France and Russia had conditioned it to expect. The green troops would break, the air would clear the path, the armor would advance through the gap. He had done this before. He expected to do it again. What Rommel had not fully accounted for was the American army's relationship with diagnosis and corrective action. Other armies, in 1940 and 1941, had absorbed the Stuka's lesson and worked to respond to it. But the pace and thoroughness of that response had been limited by doctrinal conservatism, by inter-service rivalry, by the natural human tendency to explain away catastrophic failures rather than examine them. The British, to their considerable credit, had made genuine progress, but the War Office memorandum and the desensitization drills had moved through the command structure slowly, unevenly, reaching some units fully and others not at all. The American Army, in early 1943, had a quality that would frustrate its enemies for the remaining 2.5 years of the war. When something didn't work, it convened a meeting, found the people who understood the problem, gave them resources, and expected results by a specific date. The man given the problem of Stuka panic in Tunisia was Brigadier General Terry de la Mesa Allen, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Allen was not a gentleman, and he was not a subtle man. He was a cavalry officer, a former amateur boxer, a commander whose troops both feared and adored him. He had gotten to Tunisia ahead of the First Armored's disaster at KASSERINE, and had therefore had slightly longer to observe the Stuka's effects on green American troops. What he observed, and what he told his staff with characteristic directness, was that American soldiers were physically capable of standing up to German air attack. Their bodies were not damaged disproportionately. Their equipment, when they stayed with it, was adequate. What was failing was not their bodies, it was the 6 inches between their ears. Allen's solution was brutally practical. In the training areas behind the Tunisian front lines in March 1943, the 1st Infantry Division ran what became known informally among the men as Stuka School. The course was simple in design and genuinely unpleasant in execution. Soldiers were formed up in the open, no cover, no nearby shelter, and RAF aircraft flew dive attack profiles at them, not simulated dive attacks at a safe distance. Actual attack profiles, aircraft coming down to within a few hundred feet before pulling out, while the soldiers stood their ground. The first sessions were, according to surviving accounts from NCOs who ran them, nearly as chaotic as the real thing. Men scattered, officers screamed at them to hold. They held better the next time. And the time after that. The physiological logic was exactly what Crimp had stumbled onto in the desert, through painful experience. The acoustic trigger that produced the panic response was not some unbreakable biological law. It was a conditioned response, which meant it could be deconditioned. Repeated exposure to the stimulus in a survivable context, a context in which the brain eventually registered, heard that sound, stayed still, did not die, gradually rebuilt the rational override. The siren rose. The brain processed it. The legs stayed put. Not because the men weren't afraid, because they had learned what fear felt like at that frequency, and had practiced what to do with it. The Army's own psychological warfare officers, working alongside the division trainers, contributed something else, an explanation. They told the soldiers what they were hearing and why it worked. They explained the Jericho Trumpet. They explained that the siren was not the bomb, that the bomb came afterward, and that the siren itself, for all its terror, was just wind through a tin tube. They gave the soldiers a mental model that separated the acoustic experience from the threat. When you hear the scream, the training instructors told them, that is the moment you are actually safest. The aircraft is committed to its dive. The pilot is looking at his aiming point. You are no longer his primary problem. Get down and wait. Get down and wait. Not run. Not freeze face down in the sand. Get down and wait. That instruction, backed by repeated practical experience that confirmed it, proved transformative. The men who went through Allen's desensitization training and then went forward to fight in Sicily in July 1943 behaved differently under Stuka attack than American soldiers had behaved at KASSERINE. 5 months earlier, the difference was documented in after-action reports that read like a study in contrast. Sicily, AAR entries describe units holding position under dive attack, anti-aircraft gunners staying on their weapons, officers maintaining command continuity, men returning to their positions within minutes of an attack rather than hours. Private Turner, who had run at Fade Pass and knew it, and had gone through Stuka school in its aftermath, described his first experience in Sicily with quiet satisfaction. They came in over the ridge, same as before. I heard the sirens, and I can't say I wasn't scared, because I was, but my legs didn't go this time. I knew what was coming. I knew what to do. I went down behind my half-track and I covered my head, and I thought, I know this. I know this sound. It doesn't own me. It doesn't own me. In those 4 words is the entire history of the Stuka's decline. Understanding what happened next requires understanding that the Stuka's psychological power and its physical vulnerability had always been inseparable, and that the Allies, in solving the psychological problem, inevitably solved the physical one as well. The Ju-87 was a dive bomber designed for a specific operational environment, one in which Allied air cover was absent or minimal, in which Allied ground-based anti-aircraft defenses were scattered and poorly coordinated, and in which Allied soldiers broke and ran when attacked. In that environment, the Stuka's physical limitations, its relatively low speed, its fixed undercarriage, its vulnerability to fighter attack, were irrelevant. It operated below the altitude at which Allied fighters typically patrolled. It attacked quickly and departed quickly, and the disruption it caused to Allied command and control made effective anti-aircraft response difficult to organize. But every one of those assumptions was dependent, ultimately, on soldiers who ran. Soldiers who ran gave the Stuka time. Running men were unpredictable in their movements and direction, which complicated anti-aircraft gun laying. Running men abandoned their anti-aircraft weapons, leaving them silent. Running men broke the communication networks that coordinated air defense, because the telephone operators ran too. The radio operators ran. The officers who should have been calling in fighter cover ran. The Stuka's physical vulnerability existed in a bubble of protection, created by the panic it induced. Take the panic away, and the bubble collapsed. This is exactly what happened by the time of the Sicily campaign, and even more clearly in Italy in late 1943. Allied soldiers, who held their positions under dive attack, did something that running soldiers never could. They shot back, and they did it with increasing effectiveness. with the full weight of American industrial production behind them. The Allied anti-aircraft build-up in the Mediterranean theater by late 1943 was genuinely staggering. The M140mm Bofors gun, produced in American factories at a rate that Krupp's engineers would have found incomprehensible, was being fielded in numbers that saturated the airspace over Allied positions at the precise altitudes and dive angles that Stuka attack required. The weapon's effective ceiling of roughly 23,000 feet was far above any altitude at which the Ju-87 could operate usefully. Its rate of fire, 120 rounds per minute, meant that a Stuka committed to a dive had 2 or 3 seconds of exposure to concentrated fire from a well-served Bofors battery, while the gun crew, trained, steady, running, tracked it down its attack profile. The Stuka crews began taking losses that their attrition rate had never previously required them to absorb. Not catastrophic losses, not the kind of losses that ended campaigns, but consistent, punishing, unsustainable losses in an air force that by 1943 was already cannibalizing its training pipeline to keep frontline units up to strength. The RAF and USAAF fighters, operating increasingly with effective air superiority over the battlefields of the Mediterranean and later Northwest Europe, added a second layer of attrition. The Ju-87 at low altitude on its attack run was one of the most vulnerable aircraft in the German inventory. It had always been so, and Luftwaffe commanders had always known it. The aircraft had been designed for use under a friendly air umbrella that by 1943 barely existed. Every Stuka mission over Allied-held territory now required fighter escort, and every Stuka mission without fighter escort was a lesson in vulnerability that the crews paid for personally. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated German serviceman of the entire war, the Stuka pilot whose total of tank kills exceeded 600, survived the war by a combination of extraordinary skill and extraordinary luck, and in his post-war memoirs was honest about what the later years of the war cost his group. "The losses we could not replace," Rudel wrote. "Not the aircraft. We had aircraft. The men. The trained, experienced men. We were losing pilots faster than we could replace them, and the new ones we were getting had half the training hours of the men they were replacing." The training hours differential tells the broader industrial story with particular clarity. An American fighter pilot entering combat in 1944 had between 300 and 400 flight hours before his first operational mission. A German pilot entering combat in the same period often had under 150. And that number declined steadily as the war continued, as fuel shortages bit deeper and training programs were compressed or curtailed. The mathematics of attrition that had worked so profoundly against the Allies in 1940, when German pilots were experienced veterans and Allied pilots were beginners, had reversed completely. The operational consequence for the Stuka by 1944 was simple. The aircraft had become a liability that its own commanders were reluctant to commit. The Luftwaffe's inventory still included hundreds of Ju-87s. They flew when conditions were permissive. Conditions were almost never permissive. And then something happened that is, in its own understated way, one of the most remarkable admissions in the history of air power. The German ground crews began removing the Jericho Trumpet sirens. The documentation of this is fragmentary. Maintenance records, individual pilot memoirs, post-war interviews, but the picture that emerges is consistent. By late 1943 and into 1944, Stuka units operating on the Eastern Front began stripping the SIREN impellers from their aircraft, or simply leaving them disconnected and fairing over the mounting points. The official reason, when one was given, was aerodynamic. The SIREN assembly created approximately 8 miles per hour of drag at cruise speed, a meaningful penalty for an aircraft that was already slow and becoming slower relative to the Allied aircraft hunting it. This was true. The drag penalty was real. But the pilots knew something else was true as well. The SIREN no longer did what it had once done. Allied soldiers had been trained not to run. Allied soldiers stood their ground and shot back. And the SIREN, the Trumpet of Jericho that had broken French armies, and scattered British divisions, and sent American boys fleeing across the Tunisian desert, was now nothing but noise. Worse than noise, because it identified the aircraft from a greater distance and gave Allied anti-aircraft gunners additional time to acquire and track it. The Trumpet had become a target marker. The psychological weapon that had changed the course of the fall of France was being removed, quietly, by the men who had once relied on it, not because it had been destroyed, not because it had been jammed or countered by technology, but because the men on the ground had simply refused to be afraid of it anymore. By the summer of 1944, the Normandy campaign had reduced the Stuka's presence over the Western Front to near irrelevance. Allied air superiority was effectively total by daylight. The Ju-87, always dependent on operating below a friendly air umbrella that no longer existed, could not survive in the airspace over the beaches and bocage of Normandy long enough to be useful. Its crews knew this. Missions were flown only at night or at dawn, when the risk of Allied fighter interception dropped from near certain death to merely probable death. The Eastern Front remained the Stuka's last operational theatre of significance. The sheer scale of the land war in Russia, the distances involved, and the different nature of air superiority there meant that Ju-87S continued to fly combat missions until the final weeks of the war. Rudel flew his last combat mission in April 1945, landing on a road in Czechoslovakia with half his aircraft shot away. The Stuka flew until the end, but its reign of psychological terror, the specific thing that had made it historically unprecedented, the systematic weaponization of mass panic as a force multiplier, that had ended years before the last aircraft touched down. The final statistics of the Stuka's war carry a complexity that resists simple categorization. In 5.5 years of combat operations across every European and North African theatre, the Ju-87 destroyed an extraordinary quantity of physical equipment, tanks by the thousands, artillery pieces by the tens of thousands, ships, bridges, railheads, supply dumps beyond precise counting. Rudel alone claimed to have destroyed a Soviet battleship, a cruiser, a destroyer, and more than 500 tanks in addition to his 600-plus other armored vehicles. These numbers are staggering and may be somewhat inflated by the fog of combat reporting, but even discounted, they represent a contribution to German arms that no other single aircraft type can match. But the Stuka's physical destruction, as striking as it was always secondary to its psychological effect, and the psychological effect is the rarer, stranger, more historically significant contribution. No weapon system, in the history of air warfare, was as deliberately, explicitly designed to act on the human mind, rather than the human body. The Jericho Trumpet was not an accidental feature of the aircraft's design. It was not an aesthetic choice. It was a patent-protected, procurement-mandated weapon, listed in Luftwaffe documents as a demoralization device. And it worked, for 3 years, better than anyone who had not been subjected to it could imagine. The veteran French, British, Commonwealth and American soldiers who faced and overcame the Stuka's SIREN represent a particular kind of human achievement that doesn't fit neatly into conventional military heroism. They didn't storm machine gun nests. They didn't repel tank attacks with hand grenades. What they did was harder in some ways, because it required each of them individually to locate something inside themselves that the SIREN was designed to destroy. The capacity to stand still, to think, to act, rather than simply react. Corporal Crimp came home to England in 1945 and eventually wrote the diary that had seen him through the desert. Sergeant Smith had survived Dunkirk and gone on to fight in Italy. Private Turner was wounded in France in September 1944 and spent the end of the war in a hospital in England. He went home to Georgia in early 1946. In an interview conducted in the 1970s, Turner was asked what he thought about when he remembered the war. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember the first time the Stukas came and I ran. I'm not ashamed of it. Nobody who wasn't there would understand. And I remember the first time they came, and I didn't run. I remember thinking, I know you now. And that was that. I know you now. And that was that. The walls of Jericho had fallen once. And then the children of the besieged had studied the trumpets, had learned their frequency, had stood in the open fields with the sound rising around them, and had practiced not moving until the practice became reflex, and the reflex became character. The Stuka's last siren was disconnected by a German ground crewman in the winter of 194-344 at some airfield on the Eastern Front, whose name has not been recorded. He was removing a weapon that had already been defeated, not by better aircraft, not by electronic countermeasures, not by any technological superiority, but by soldiers who had been taught to understand their own fear. Von Richthofen had understood in 1940 that the mind was the most important target on any battlefield. What he had not anticipated was that the soldiers whose minds he targeted would eventually understand this too, and that an enemy who understood the mechanism of his own panic was an enemy who could be made immune to it. The Trumpet of Jericho brought down walls for 3 years, and then men learned to stand before the sound, and look up, and wait, and the walls stood firm. Remember Corporal Vernier, running west from the Meuse in the morning mist of May 13, 1940. He survived the fall of France. He was taken prisoner in June and spent 4 years in a German camp in Silesia. He was liberated in January 1945 by soldiers of the Soviet Red Army and eventually made his way home to Rennes. He never wrote about running at Sedan, but he wrote, in a letter to his sister in the spring of 1945, something that stands as the quiet, hard-won verdict of all the men who heard the trumpet and lived to reckon with it. The worst thing, he wrote, was not that we ran, it was that we did not know that one day we would stop running. If someone had told me that morning, "You will learn to stand still under this," I would not have believed them. But it turns out that people can learn nearly anything, if the need is great enough. Nearly anything, if the need is great enough. The scream from heaven lasted 3 years, and then the ground taught itself to be silent, and the sky, in time, fell quiet too. If you stayed until the end, thank you. These stories deserve to be remembered in full, not as headlines, not as footnotes, but as lived experience. If this documentary meant something to you, I invite you to subscribe and join this channel. There are many more stories like this to tell. Stories about fear, endurance, and the quiet strength of ordinary men. And if someone in your family served, feel free to share their name in the comments. History is not only what was recorded, it's what was carried home. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.